Welcome to part two of my interview with Joe Baxter-Webb of Indie Game Clinic. This will be the continuation of our podcast discussing video games, game design, academia, and a lot more. So with that, please enjoy the rest of this cast, already in progress. And the same idea of, again, just saying, well, in my game it's exactly like 7 levels, and I must have a 4 stealth section, or I must, if I'm making a shooter, must always include a shotgun, and if it doesn't, then it's not a real game, or it's not the real example of it. It really doesn't work. I think it's why we've seen so many, underground hits over the past decade. All developers are saying, well, what if I make my RPG but I do it like this? Well, if I make a shooter and I do it a different way? And again, you never know what's really going to stick until you actually do it. And yet, that's not, and I know some people will misconstrue it and say, well, then that just means just close your eyes and design whatever and will be amazing. Well, no, that's not always going to be the case. But being, as you said, being able to figure out, okay, does this work? Yes or no, is very important. And if you just try and take shortcuts, you try to ignore that, then you just end up just throwing darts blindly in the dark and hoping maybe this idea will work.
But, I think sometimes you have to throw some blind darts. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's helpful to not invest everything into one project, and to be able to put one aside for a little while and work on something else and then go back to the thing and see it with fresh eyes. Because a lot of people, they're working on their game. They've got a day job. They get some time to work on their game. They open up a project in a piece of software. They go, what was I doing? They look at it and they go, oh, I've got to build a menu. Okay, I'll build a menu. And, obviously it comes with the privilege of having more time. But if you can make lots of little things and then jump between them occasionally, it's a lot easier to look at them more objectively, I think. Whereas this is one of the reasons why I'm always skeptical of people working on one big game project for a long time, because it's you get the metaphor of the frog boiling in the pot. Do you know that one? If there's a frog sitting in some water and the water heats up while they're in it, they don't realize and they boil. Whereas if you I don't know if this is true. I hope it. If it is true, I hope it wasn't worked out through some kind of horrible experiment. But if you put the frog in the boiling water, they will realize it's boiling and they will jump out. Whereas if they're sitting in the boiling water when it boils, then they won't realize, right? And that's kind of like what it's like being on a long project, is you don't realize that it's bad because you've just spent so long time on it. And it's not just like sunk cost fallacy. It's just the fact you can't even see that there's certain things wrong with it. And again, that's why you make playtesting part of your practice. That's why you make review with other people part of your practice. One of the biggest pitfalls for new folks is just thinking people are going to thinking something's not ready to show people. And it's like, well, it needs to be shown to people, because how are you going to assess the gameplay if you don't see someone interact with it? You're not showing it to people to impress them. You're showing it to people to get information about your game. And the other one is thinking people are going to steal your ideas, which is you pass the same idea through different people, you end up with a different end product anyway. So,
and getting that feedback is another very hard part. I guess this also, I think, really ties well with academia, because obviously you're playing games from first-time developers, you're playing projects along those lines, and being able to understand feedback is one of the harder aspects, I think, for a lot of new people, even some established people who are in this space. So I guess with your time teaching design, what was it like, I guess, educating people about accepting and understanding feedback with their projects?
Yeah, there's layers to that, right? Because I've always encouraged people to do fast forward testing. It's the framework that Jesse Shell has, where it's you ask people a set series of questions, where it's like, what was your favorite thing? What did you find frustrating? What did you want to do? If you had a wand, what would you change? I usually change that to wish, because it's a bit easier to understand. What were you doing in the game, and describe the game. And the reason I really like that framework, and we've got lots of people doing it on our Discord now because I keep going on and on about it, is it forces people to focus on the activity and the fantasy of what they're doing rather than to like a lot of the time if you give people a grey box prototype, they'll go, there wasn't any art, and they'll just tell you stuff you already know, and it's like, well, I know there wasn't any art. But there's layers because there's like that side of things of like how do you set up a playtest, right? Like what sort of questions do you ask people? Do you give them a form? All of that kind of stuff. And then there's the kind of more psychological side of understanding that when you put people in that situation, like what do you need to watch out for in terms of like, I don't know, just like weird things that humans do that you wouldn't expect. So one of them is when you're doing like tutorial playtesting or testing people's like first time user experience, you really have to watch them and note where they get stuck because they won't remember. So like if someone gets stuck on a point in a tutorial for like 45 seconds and it's bad, right? You don't want that to happen. And then they work it out and they get over it. They won't self-report at the end of the tutorial that they got stuck there, right? So you need to either have, if it's like an online demo, you need to have data feeding that back to let you know what the time difference was between the tutorial points, or you need to be watching a playtest and taking notes. Because when you have that aha moment and you go, oh, I know, and you move on, it's almost like your memory just wipes that little embarrassing, frustrating moment before where you didn't know, right? And they're the sort of things that you just have to like be present for and understanding what's going on. And it can feel really weird because it's like it is a bit like running a science experiment, and you have to put the playtester at ease. You have to tell them what you're looking for. You have to tell them like, look, I'm not here to judge whether you're good or not at this game. I'm not going to be like laughing at you if you're rubbish at it. I'm and it depending on what type of project it is and what stage it is, you're going to give them more or less information and all of that kind of stuff. And I think, yeah, like I said a moment ago, just fundamentally accepting that the whole thing is there to benefit you by making your game better. It's not there for you to show off your game or impress someone with it, you know?
And like to your point about being able to watch someone play a game, maybe just watch footage of them playing the game, is such a big aspect of this. Because you said, like, and I think this also goes like another very interesting aspect of time getting feedback, that there's a huge difference between like showing a game to like some random people, your friends and family, versus showing it to someone who does this for a living. And getting feedback from both groups is very important, because we've seen the echo chamber effect happen time and time again. Of, I think you brought this point up earlier about getting no feedback, doing like no kind of marketing, and then just putting this game out into the world like some random Thursday. That doesn't work, and you have to be able to get feedback from different sources. And I've spoken with people who do like QA work, who've done like playtesting sessions, and they talk about, I think one of the points I think was really poignant is that you can have 10 different people have 10 different complaints about your game, and they're all talking about the same exact thing.
Yeah. So often you're like, the thing I was kind of trained to do in my first job was try and note down the problem, not the solution, because people will say, oh, that enemy has too much health. And it's like, well, okay, I think the actual problem we're experiencing here is that the enemy took too long to defeat. And then the solution is we can reduce their health, or we can do some other things. We can make the player do more damage. There's other things we can do, right? So when you're looking for problems in the game and you're using the playtesting as data from that, the thing you try and record is the problem rather than jumping immediately to a solution and recording that, because then that goes on your task list and then you forget why you were doing it. And actually, if you'd recorded the problem, then you could think of different possible solutions for that. And I think you sort of mentioned about different types of playtesters as well. One of my trick questions with playtesting is to ask people what games the game reminded them of, right? Because sometimes, like, if you're if you're trying to like work out the core of a game, usually it makes sense to get people that are real big fans of that type of game to start off with. But then maybe like a more casual audience who don't play that type of game are quite good for testing tutorials or testing like they're the sort of people that if you listen to them, you're going to have a larger audience, right? And then if you listen to the core genre fans, you're going to have a more dedicated audience. And you kind of want to do a bit of both of those. But the question I really like is when someone's finished playing the game, what games did this most remind you of, right? Because that's going to actually test if they're a core genre fan in a way that you won't get through any other question, right? Because if you ask them, do you play this sort of game? They'll go, yeah. You know, it's like a performative answer. Whereas if you say you're making like a Souls-like beat 'em up, and you say, what did this remind you of? And like one person says, oh, you know, I played Dynasty Warriors years ago, and it reminds me sort of that. And then there's someone else who's way more up to date, and they're like, oh, it was like it was like Souls-like, but it was like a little bit more like Sekiro than like Bloodborne. It's like, okay, you're the person that I really need to listen to, you know. So it's like you can't get that information on who is this playtester and what does their data tell me by directly asking them like, do you play this type of game? Because they won't really be honest with you because they'll say what they think they need to say for the playtest, you know.
Yep. And it's always like fun when you get like different feedback like that and be able to understand, okay, you know, the person who never played a Souls-like before may not be the best one to ask about, you know, how detailed the combat was. But if you're wondering about whether or not the game was easy to understand or if the UI UX was working, yeah, getting impressions from that new time person or that first timer is very important for you.
Yeah. There's usually like a pyramid, right, of this small compact group of like who are the sickos for that type of game that are your like real core, but they're not like the total amount of people who will ever play the game, right? That bigger base of the pyramid is much bigger, and we know that from like game completion statistics of like, just how many people buy games that they don't complete, right? So we know that the audience is way bigger than just those really hardcore people, and lots of people are quite happy to buy a game and only get halfway through it or whatever because that's fine with them. And that's still interesting because that larger sort of more casual group that aren't as really into this thing, the game still needs to appeal to them, right? So it's still whatever the fantasy is, whatever the core thing you're doing in the game still needs to appeal to them on some level, otherwise it won't work.
Yep. And again, it's why being able to research these different games and these designs is very important to understand why people want to play a platform or why they want to do a real-time strategy game. And I've like heard from like when I was like doing like some like basic consulting, like listening to other people like talk to me about stuff. They'll like say things like, "Well, I don't know what I want to make next. Maybe I should try and make either an RPG, a space sim, or a visual novel game." Okay, well, those are three completely different universes. Like, you should be trying to figure out like what do you want to make as a developer. And it's all into, I think this is another very interesting point. I'm curious what your thoughts on this. That one aspect of game design I find fascinating, at least like looking at a lot of newer developers and first timers, is that the knowledge pool out there, I think, has just grown tremendously in the past 15 years. I've played games from like first or even like second time developers that feel like decades ahead of games from people who've been working in this industry who may not have done game dev. And when I talk to them, they will just rattle off a list of every single game of that genre that they played and they studied and they, tore apart to figure out what they wanted out of it. And I think it's always like very interesting to see just how much like people are able to study a game today compared again as we've been talking about those who will just go in saying, I want to make Doom. And that's their entire, goal of their project.
Yeah. It does really show when someone is like a super fan of a particular thing, right? That they do that. But why wouldn't you? You know, I know that there's people that are more commercially oriented, and I'm going to sound like some kind of like hippie when I say this sort of stuff. But I think there is when you get people who are like a skilled developer, they have the practical skills required to actually make the game, and they're also someone that deeply cares about the type of game they're making. Then they're driven by sort of making a contribution to that thing. You know, it's there's a certain degree of like testing yourself personally of like, can I do this thing? Can I contribute to this thing that I love? And then there's this like broader sense of legacy of like, oh, I want to be the person that combined these two things, you know? And yeah, I mean, I don't really know if I have much else to add there, but it is so when we talk about research as well, I think and I talked right at the beginning about how important it is to play. I think a barrier that lots of people have is because you've grown up with games as a pastime and as a waste of time in a lot of people's minds. It takes some people were making games for a very long time before they realize that they need to play games as part of their job. And that they and you know, people say, oh, it's ruined games for me, I can't play them in the same way without thinking about them. Well, that's just the same as being, you know, very good at any particular thing. But I think people have this mental barrier of like, oh, I shouldn't be playing games. I should be writing more code, or I should be doing this other thing. You know, I should be making more 3D models because that's work, and playing the games isn't work. And it's like, well, you know, if you're trying to make a decent contribution in a particular genre of games, then yeah, playing like 8 games in that genre or playing the best, the top 10 is part of your job now. You know, and if you go from like, if you get studio work very early on, you'll see that from experience that, you know, your boss says we're making one of these, so you need to download these 4 games and play them, right? That's part of the experience we get working in game studios. But if you've never had that because you're just starting as a hobbyist, it's very hard to make that mental turn towards, oh, I need to like actively, deliberately play the types of things I want to make. It seems obvious to some people, and other people really, really struggle with it because they still see playing games as a waste of time, which is kind of funny because why would you want to make them if you've got that, you know?
Yeah. Oh yeah, and again, it's why, like I always say, you need to study a lot of these games because you're never going to again like be able to grasp why a game did something just by watching footage of it. And it's again like why for a lot of long time listeners that I talk so much about the importance of game preservation and being able to check out games from 5, 10, 15, 20 plus years ago.
Yeah. And not bury them all in a landfill like the ET cartridges, right?
Yeah.
I used to work with someone who had one of those on the shelf in his office. He got one of the OGs.
Nice. And with all the discussions we had about game design academia, I think there's also, I think, a good time to ask you a few questions about your channel, Indie Game Critic, or I'm sorry, Indie Game Clinic.
Yeah.
And I guess, like, for people who aren't aware, could you talk a little bit about kind of like what you do or like what your channel's about?
Yeah, sure. So I think it can be a bit confusing because there's lots of game dev YouTubers, right? And I think people see one and then they think, oh, this is what game dev YouTubers do. And then they go over to another one and they assume it's going to be the same, right? So I set mine up as a clinic because it was never meant to be a channel about me making games. I do occasionally stream my own projects now mainly because as the channel's gone on, it's shifted from just being videos to being more streams because I just like hanging around with my audience who join the streams, and that's quite fun. But yeah, I have a submission process. People send me their games. The main weekly stream that I do every week is games that are sent in which are still being worked on. So if something's already been launched and it's like commercially available for a price, I don't cover it on that stream. And we try and do themes. So I might do. This week we had a game about delivering stuff yesterday, which was actually one of my Discord sort of patron supporters games. And then tomorrow we're going to be covering 2 other games that have been sent in about delivering stuff. So we pick a theme or we pick a genre or whatever, and we bundle some games together. Occasionally I get games that seem like they need a bit more time, so I will schedule a whole stream for them. I'm doing that next week with a really interesting historical puzzle game called Cracks Where the Light Gets In. And yeah, it's like I said right at the start of like, when you get a bit more into kind of intermediate or master's level learning in a subject, it becomes less about learning principles that you can apply to everything, and it becomes more about like getting feedback on one specific thing you're working on. So I run these streams, I give feedback. I've seen you do similar things as well, where you kind of just play the game and talk about design principles through the game. And I think one of the reasons why the channel has done well is like we've built up quite a good community of people that are working on their game and came to the channel because they submitted their game, and then they hang around in the chat, and then they become, part of the feedback for the future devs. So I've got like regulars in the chat who are also there giving their feedback, and it's very much structured that way of like, okay, initially the initial peel might be this person is an expert and I'm going to go and hear what they have to say, but really I'm trying to just think out loud and then encourage other people to think like game designers by going, okay, here's how I think. But yeah, it's kind of, it's that, and then we do video essays as well. I try and keep things a bit silly as well. I'm not trying to be like a hardcore theorist that's making a new theory of everything, and part of that is just sustainability for myself. If I'm not like a super serious person, I guess. And I also find being a bit goofy and having some in jokes and stuff like that just tends to attract a nicer crowd, Or if you, I don't know, how much you've experienced this, but if you position yourself just totally as a vocational teacher of like, listen to me and you'll learn how to do this thing and it will improve your life, that tends to attract a sort of a particular type of person, whereas being around just as sort of like a bit more of a friendly person for people to hang out with and have a fun time with attracts a different sort of person, right? And I kind of want the people that are right in the middle of those groups. But yeah, it's I mean, you've had your channel for way longer than me now, right? And it's always evolving when you do one of these things. You try different things and you go, okay, maybe I do that a bit different next time, or you drop one type of content and you try another one. It's always a moving target. It's kind of very iterative, just like making a game, and even doing more formal courses when I was teaching at university is very similar. It's like you have something you want people to learn or experience. You set something up, they come in, you do it to them, and then at the end you go, oh, which bits worked, which bits didn't, and it's a bit slower to change in an academic context, like a strict academic context, because you can only change things every year. But it's still that same process of you're trying stuff out, you're seeing if it hits for people. Maybe you're starting to subdivide the audience, and you're going, oh, those viewers or those students really liked that thing but didn't like that thing. All of that reviewing as you go. Yeah, I quite like doing it. I like. It's a good break from the slog of making games, which is like very long projects, to be making something that is based around making lots of little episodes of content. Yeah.
And very interesting about studying like new games, or about like playing games based on themes like that. Because I've been starting to do that with like playing games from like first time developers and projects on my channel. And as you said, like, how you position yourself, I think, is very important, because I know, like, for me, I think everyone hopefully will agree that I don't talk about the stuff as, if you do this, your game will sell 10 million copies, or, this is the only way to make games, and that will be it. It's far more nuanced, and again, it's a far more challenging topic. And as you said, like, there's far more, like, game design channels now than there were, like, 15, 16 years ago. And it is very tricky to stand out. I think that has to kind of go with like this kind of like growing ecosystem between like indie development and like YouTube channels, because everyone talks about, oh, I just want my game to be covered by a PewDiePie or a Markiplier or a Northern Lion, and that kind of like is like focusing on like the big names. I think has kind of either like died down or it's really cooled down. Because even in that point, as we said, like you can't just base your game or even your channel success on doing like one thing and hoping, putting all your eggs in one basket.
Yeah, totally. I sort of see my channel as a bit of a bridge between like a design theory and practical dev channel and like just being like an entertainment channel about indie games. And I think I deliberately try and find people that are making games but are also very passionate about indie games, because there are definitely developers out there who are working on a game but they're not interested in any games apart from the one they're working on, right? And I'm not necessarily as interested in that type of crowd. But yeah, you're right, and I think part of it comes from people are saturated with loads of media options of like they're playing a game while they're watching a movie and stuff like that, and that means that when they come to pick content creators and stuff like that, they want someone who does more than one thing. They follow this content creator because they're funny and also they do this thing, or they're very educated about this thing and this thing, which is a surprising mix, right? It's never, you can't really be a one-trick pony, because people will just come to you for one thing and then go away. It's like the videos that you look up on YouTube when you need to fix your dishwasher or something. And there's like a channel that has all of these technical tutorials, and it's like, okay, I'm going to like and subscribe your video, but I'm not sitting here watching them all in sequence, right? So the folks that get people doing that are the people that kind of appeal to them in multiple ways. And when I think of like the people that I've followed over the years, a lot of them are folks where, over time I've just realized that I kind of enjoy listening to them and their worldview and stuff like that, and would listen to them talk about anything. And I think one of the reasons why games are such a nice topic to have is because they are so broad. Like you said, if someone's going, I could make an RPG or a visual novel or a space sim, it's like, yeah, that's those three games, and we call them all the same thing. Video games are more different from like any type of film is from any other type of film, or any type of book is from any other type of book in terms of like the structure and material of them. And that means that if it's your job to talk about games, there's quite a lot of breadth and variety there, which is nice. One of the reasons why I struggle with a lot of the content about game dev is it's so heavily about business and marketing, and I can't listen to anyone talk about any of that for more than 30 minutes without falling asleep, unfortunately. But that's why I've never been super financially successful doing anything. So what do I know?
And again, like I think that's like always a funny thing about like these game design topics, especially like as we're talking, like this conversation is going for just about 90 minutes. That there are some people who, if you try and explain them a topic for more than like 2 to 3 minutes, they check out. And then you have people like, I will sit and listen to this 5-hour game design lecture and absorb every single word that you say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good test for yourself. It's like, just what can you get like that about, because the best thing that you could ever make in your life is probably going to be rooted in that level of obsession. Yeah.
So, speaking about being like 90 minutes long, I said that we're going to try and wrap things up in the next few minutes. One thing that I wanted to touch on before we go, of course. So, for the game that you're working on, like DirtWorld, like how long have you been working on that for?
So I started that about May or June last year. And partly it was just, I haven't done any hands-on development in a little while. Like the role that I had before that was in a mobile company where I did nothing in engine. The role before that, I did do stuff in engine, but we were making like Roblox experience of Fortnite maps. So I was kind of doing like level creation and like basic bits of that. And I thought, okay, I'm going to do what everyone does. I'm going to make a basic platformer with not really any intentions. And I also wanted to do something where I could do some world building and some art, but like in the simplest way possible. So the way that project started was I had someone else's template for like a ZX Spectrum game on Game Maker. And I started with the art constraints of that, of just like really, really small 12 by 12 pixel blocks and everything like that. And then I was playing Blueprints at the time, and I was really interested in what Blueprints was doing. Because if anyone listening who hasn't played Blueprints, it's based on a board game, or one of the things it's based on is a board game called The Castles of Mad King Ludwig, where you have a big tile of rooms and you build a castle by connecting these higgledy-piggledy tiles. And Blueprints is a game that uses that system, but you are in first person and you can walk around within the thing that you build. And I thought you could do this in a platformer and it could be quite interesting. And then at the same time, I'd been reading Derek Yu's book about Spelunky, which is one of my favorite games ever. And I was thinking about how much I like the object manipulation in Spelunky, which is like, you know, you can do the old school Mario thing of like you can pick a object up above your head and run around with it and throw it. And I was thinking how much, how many variations of gameplay you can get out of just that action of like having an inventory of one thing you can carry over your head. I guess Smash Brothers does a similar thing, I think. But you can have like fragile objects like jars that you throw and they smash against a wall and something falls out of them. You can throw things into receptacles, you know, like triggering things by. So I sort of just started off from there. And then one of the things that I really liked in Derek Yu's book was when he was making Spelunky. This is a really good general piece of advice about mashing game genres together. But when he was making Spelunky, he was thinking about how he liked roguelikes, but they were too obtuse. You know, it was very hard to learn them because there were like weird things you had to do to win each one of these like old school ASCII roguelikes. And then he liked platformers, but he didn't like playing the same level over and over again. So he used the two things he put together, like the platformer and the roguelike, to kind of solve problems he saw with each genre, right? So he sort of plugged them into each other in a particular way. And then I was kind of thinking that way of like, okay, I'm going to put this room drafting thing where you go up to a door, you open the door, it says which room do you put in next, and then you put the room in. I'm going to put that together with a platformer and see what it achieves. And then I just kind of kept working on that. And an art style and a little bit of world building kind of gradually came out of that. And I think in a lot of ways I'm doing things that I would never encourage anyone else to do that are big wastes of time, right? But at the same time, I've been reasonably restrained with it. Like I've developed an art style that I know I can achieve reasonably well on my own, and other people seem to find appealing. And yeah, the kind of lore of it is that you're like a little golem that works for a wizard who exists in this castle at the end of time, and you're like building a dungeon out of these rooms that are generated by a machine. And it's kind of like you're going on little jobs for him, and you bring him food back and you bring him treasure back and stuff like that. He's really mean. He's a really nasty wizard. And yeah, it's just been an interesting one to develop. And I like, just to throw back to playtesting that we were talking about earlier, I think I worked on it for a couple of months, and then I got 2 or 3 people on Discord to playtest it for me. That was really helpful. It drew out loads of issues with like the controller and the game feel of just how it felt to jump around and stuff like that. It identified issues with how much information the players were getting about certain things. Like people didn't understand the room drafting mechanic, or the fact that it spent keys when you opened the door. So that was like, okay, so when you open the door, we need to have the key fly in from the interface at the top and fly down and hit the door and then build the room, right? So you start to, you know, from the initial playtesting, even really early on, you start to kind of change those sorts of things. And I think one of the things that, although this game has been quite difficult to build, one of the things that's been very good about it is because I haven't started with a setting that is like the real world or anything, I've been able to like make everything up from scratch, right? Because it's this very weird fantasy setting. I can just go, oh, there's these magic keys and they do this. And and there's like these crystals that do this and stuff. As soon as you're like grounded in a particular setting that people understand, like modern life or gangsters or cowboys, it's like, you know, you need to have a horse and you need to have a gun and they all need to work this way. But because I'm doing something a little bit more surreal, it's been a lot easier to just sort of like change things in the direction of the gameplay as we go along, because I'm developing the gameplay first and then building a world and story around it that fit that. So yeah, it's not like I'm gonna try and get it finished this year. There's a few playtesters. I released an alpha in December, and we got like quite a lot of feedback from that. Quite a lot of people joining the Discord and playing it and stuff like that. And we've already made a bunch of changes based on that. And the real recent sticking point has just been working out what the end game of it will be. That's been quite challenging, because it's you can sort of build a system and then be like, oh, this is quite fun to play around with for a couple of hours. Oh, where is this going? And my big goal for it would be for it structurally to end up sort of like what you get in Slay the Spire, where when you get to the end of Slay the Spire, just all of the skills that you've learnt so far get tested at once. But that's really, really hard to choreograph. Because in Slay the Spire, you can do it in a single encounter, right? You can have like 30 encounters that all test a different skill, and then you can do a counter at the end that puts them all together. But I've not got an encounter-based game. It's like, as you play, you're building one big contiguous Metroidvania map until you die, and then you start a new run and you do it again, right? But yeah, it's an interesting one. I hope you get to play it at some point. Hopefully after we do the next pass on the character controller, because it's still a bit strange in some ways, like the momentum and stuff. But
so you mentioned being inspired by both Blueprints and Spelunky with wanting to make the game, and I guess besides like playing like those two games, as we've said, like to return to our earlier point about everyone having like their dream idea, or trying to figure out which idea you want to make as your first. I guess like from those two games, I guess what like really like stood out to you as I want to make my game based on these two games.
So it wasn't just those two. So there's a bunch of thematic influences as well, of like things like cartoons I watched when I was a kid and all of that kind of stuff. And I got very into like the idea of post-apocalyptic settings that are not obviously post-apocalyptic when they start off, so things like Studio Ghibli's Nausicaa of the Village of the Wind, stuff like that, where it seems like a fantasy and then you learn it's post-apocalyptic. So as I was starting the game, I was sort of developing an art style and a setting as I was going along and that kind of stuff. I think one of the things that I do, which I think is generally quite good practice, is I just have all of these ideas, they go in sketchbooks, and then at some point I realize that some of the ideas fit together in a particular way. And then it's like, okay, this is the thing I should do because it's doing all of these things at once, right? It allows me to make this type of game and experiment with this and try this setting, And I think, I've done that loads throughout my life. I wrote a comic in my early 20s that was like a cyberpunk comic that I just never did anything with. I just wrote like 400 pages of a script. And then like I've revisited that in other mediums and made a twine in the same setting and stuff like that. So I think you just have this big reservoir of ideas you build up. And then over time, when you go back to it, some of the ideas, it's like a stock market, right? The ideas go up and down in value and over time. And sometimes you take a few of the ideas and you put them together and go, oh, that is better than the sum of its parts, Like I think when you ask about the overlap of the Blueprints room drafting and the Spelunky, it's like I wouldn't normally be very motivated to make a platformer. Like I'm not super into like precision platformers like Celeste and Super Meat Boy and stuff like that. I like it as a way of just being able to move a little person around in a world, right? Which is why, platformer almost isn't a genre. It's just a control and camera schema, right? Like a Metroidvania is so different from like a precision platformer and so on.
Mm-hmm.
But I wouldn't necessarily be super enthusiastic about just making a straight platformer, but using platforming to experiment with like a totally weird way of doing this kind of build your own Metroidvania thing with room drafting was very, very appealing to me. So, it's like I think the board gamey room drafting thing is the thing that most appealed to me. But also being able to move a character around in that and have like lots of little sort of Terraria like object interactions where you can pick things up and throw them into each other and stuff. That felt very, very kind of appealing from the start. And I could see that if you were building the environment and you were in control of the build order, over time you could learn that, oh, it's better to have this room close to this room, because if I build them really far apart, then I can't take that item from that room and put it in that thing, right? So that's kind of how those drafting games work, is that at the start you don't really understand why you're picking the things you are, and then as you gain more knowledge of the game, you see the synergies. And the difference with this type of game is that the synergies are often spatial, of like, oh, it's better to have that thing next to that thing, right? Yeah.
And to your point about like the different kinds of platforming, that I think is another really interesting topic there. Because again, I was like talking to some people about consulting. They're trying to decide on a game, and someone's like, "Well, let's make a platformer." And I'm just sitting there going, "Okay, there's a lot that you can unpack in that just that one word." And like to the idea that, or to the notion of like, there's a very wide line between someone saying, "I want to make a Celeste, a Super Meat Boy, a Kaizo style platformer," versus one that's, more, I just want to watch, characters bounce around and jump off walls and do like zany stuff like that. And I guess like with this, is this like your first actual project, like you're making on your own, or have you done like smaller projects before this?
Oh yeah, loads and loads of smaller projects before. But this is the closest something has got to like. Let's say this is the first game that I've made that has required optimization, because enough other people have been playing it that have gone, oh, this runs slow, you need to optimize it, right? So, and now I'm in a position where I can like hire Gleb, the freelancer, to come in and do those sorts of things, because he understands the engine way better than I do. But yeah, I mean, it is. Just something like, oh, a platformer is so broad, and it again, that kind of holistic thinking of like the game design, the creative direction, all of it together. When I first started building the prototype, the main character was a knight. They were like a little kind of shovel knight type character, and I realized quite quickly that was going to communicate to people that this was a combat game about being a cool dude that kills loads of things, right? And I didn't want that. I wanted it to be a sort of closer to something like Noita, which is like, okay, there's combat in it, but this is a thinky game, right? So we changed to a golem. I changed to a character that was kind of cute and a bit vulnerable looking. I wanted the character to feel like maybe not a very smart character, and the players are going to keep dying all the time. He shatters into clay when you fall really far, like all the coins fly out. And that's an example of that. It's like, okay, I'm doing the art and the gameplay at the same time. What do I want the art to communicate to the players about what type of game this is, and like what to expect and what not to expect? And that's like character design in a character-driven game. Like the character design of what the character looks like tells you so much about the game, and the game should almost be built entirely around the idea of that character or the fantasy of that character. I think going back to stuff like Sonic the Hedgehog is always good with that, right? Because like the world of Sonic the Hedgehog doesn't make sense, but it does make sense when you're playing it. It's like, okay, why is this world full of loop-the-loops? Well, it's because that would be a really cool place to be if you were if you were a really fast hedgehog that could do loop-the-loops, And like a more up-to-date version would be something like Dishonored. It's like you see the character, you see they've got a hood on, you can see they've got some magical stuff going on. It's going to be a sneaky magical game, and the whole environment and everything is based around like the coolest possible place to be that type of character. But yeah, I mean, like, yeah, that whole thing of just like, oh yeah, we'll make a platformer. I think people pick genres of games because they think it's going to be easy. And any genre, when you get deep into it, has some cursed problems in it, right? Like you were talking about, like card games and deck builders earlier. Like people think, oh, I'll make one of those because you have spells are on a card and characters on a card. That's easier. And it's like, well, Yeah, but to benefit from the metaphor of a deck of cards, you have to make it really tactile and make it feel like a deck of cards and make the cards all nice and stuff, because otherwise people just it's just rectangles, right? The
Mm-hmm.
amount of those games that I've played where it's just like these are not cards, they are rectangles with some art on. And yeah. I mean, I think it's always a massive trap to pick a game genre because you don't know enough to realize that they're difficult and you think that's going to be easy.
Mm-hmm. Yep. I still remember I was following someone on a Blue Sky, and they were talking about they made like, a lot of like RPG, a lot of turn-based games, and they decided to make a 2D platformer. I remember one day they just like went on social media, they're like ranting, "Why is this camera so damn difficult to get right? Why can't I get my character in the right spot on it?"
Yeah,
And I was just sitting going, "Yep, I could have predicted that was going to be an issue."
yeah,
And,
exactly.
and it's always again like that kind. As you say, like it's always interesting to find like those challenges and how you work through them. And I'm trying to think if there's anything else. I guess anything like particular about like DirtWorld you like to mention for people listening.
I hope people play it. Like I said, the next game after this is going to be a completely mouse controlled, not action game at all. Um, I don't know. I think one of the things that I've really enjoyed about I'm sort of in a position where I can occasionally afford to pay someone to help me out with it, right? But it's not like I'm their employer. I mean, I'm giving people briefs, but I care about their taste and their input on the project as well. Very early on, I decided I wanted the music to be dungeon synth. I don't know if you know of this genre. It's kind of like lo-fi ambient synth music that sounds like it's from like an old 80s fantasy movie like Labyrinth or something, or like Dark Crystal or something like that. I was like, this game has this sort of like modernized ZX Spectrum aesthetic. I want that style of synth music. And I met some people that make that. And then we've got this like side collaboration where they're now like sort of interested in the game and how the world of the game works because they have to write music for it and stuff like that. So I think turning the game into a sort of process of like meeting people and finding out what parts of the game resonate with them has been really, really enjoyable because whenever I've had, company jobs, it's like you don't get to choose who you're working with, and often you don't get to like if there's anything involving the outside like playtesters or something. When you're working for a big company, it's very, very controlled and all NDA'd and stuff, whereas this is like, hey, we have a Discord for the game, whoever wants can join it, and I get to just kind of have this process of sometimes I'm just throwing stuff into the game because I think it would be amusing. And other times it's much more about like listening to other people, and I find that quite enjoyable as a process. Like I think there are lots of people that get into game dev because they like just working on their computer on their own for long periods of time, and I can totally relate to that. But I sort of go between extremes quite a lot. Like I'm an ambivert. I'd like heads down zoning out on one thing for 6 hours, but I also like interacting with other people. Um, and I don't think I don't have like massively high hopes for this game because I think it's too strange and I just want to get it finished and move on to the next thing. But it's been very, very enjoyable to be working on so far. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point about, as you were saying, like being able to swap to these different games, especially again, like as this being like the first game, like you're really like pushing forward to like be a release. Because I said, like I've spoken with other developers and even like people who got into game dev, who, as we were saying earlier, like they will make that first big project again to be the project. Like, I'm sure, as you're saying there, you do not imagine wanting to work on this game for like 3 to 5 years or more than that. Like, that would probably, I think I may have just scared you a little bit if I said that. And being able to, like, make these games and make them on the smaller side, I think has been, to go back to kind of like ties back to our previous section, has been a very, I think, healthy aspect of how indie development has changed. That we've seen developers who, again, like, they're not thinking that I'm gonna make my first game and make it like worth $60. They're thinking my first game $4.99, maybe pushing it to $9.99. But I'm not, this is not going to be my life for the next 5 to 10 years, because it then allows you to have these creative bursts that maybe after your next game being more, mouse control, who knows what your third game will be or your fourth game. And I think this has been like one of the biggest like growing aspects of like sustainable indie game development, is being able to give yourself that luxury of, I want to make 4 completely different games. And, if I can make them small enough, I make that it's not, putting me out of my house, I can do that. Maybe one of those games is going to be that dream idea. Maybe one of those ideas will blow up. But you're never really going to get to that point if you are not able to sustain yourself in that process.
Yeah, it's kind of what you're describing is kind of closer to the attitude we had in the Flash days, right? Where, people like Ed McMillan, right, probably made a dozen games or so before Super Meat Boy, and that was because he came from that Flash era where you weren't really selling your games. You could make money potentially if it was on a web portal and you got money from ads, but that was the only kind of commercial route to sort of making money as an indie game developer at the time. Yeah, I think the other thing that is worth touching on there is one of the appeals of roguelikes and run-based games, which we often talk about in terms of replayability and like, oh, it's different every time. It's like they're the most like easy to cite things about those games. But from a production point of view, if you make a game where you've got a beginning and an end, and then the middle is a bag of stuff that you can just add to whenever, that's quite helpful from a production point of view, because it means you can release a version of the game that's not complete and you can add to it later on and you can keep bringing people back. It doesn't, whether it's paid DLC or whether it's just like forever in early access type thing where you launch the game and then you have a roadmap and you say every 6 months I'm going to add 4 cards to this deck of cards or whatever. That's interesting to me as well, because I'm not quite at that stage yet in DirtWorld. That's where we're heading to next, is trying to work out the end game so that the middle of the game can just be shrink or stretch to be whatever size it can be in the amount of time left. Whereas if you're making like a linear game with levels, you have a bit more of a challenge there, because they need to maybe link into each other in more explicit ways. But yeah, again, I think part of the reason why all that stuff I was talking about earlier of like learning what your kind of specialism is and then learning to focus on that is important in the long run, because it allows you to do these kind of faster turnaround things. Because people often think, oh, you get faster at stuff by doing it over and over again, and whereas if you're changing what you're doing every time, you're always it's gonna slow you down, like the visual novel to platformer person you spoke about a minute ago, and some people need to do that to keep themselves interested. They want to do a different thing every time, but the larger the percentage of repeated stuff is, the quicker you're going to get, because you know how to do that stuff.
And it's kind of like a bit of a tangent, but I think so applies. With DirtWorld, is this your first kind of push or doing like proc gen in a game?
I've done it before in terms of just like, creating a level and doing noise and stuff in the level. The thing that I think is quite interesting about this game is it's not really proc gen. It is when you build a room, you draft a room from a selection of 3, and that means that you build this big level, and if you die prematurely, you might have only built 4 or 5 rooms. But if there's a bit of a meta game upgrade where you can unlock more keys and stuff, so you can build a bigger level, and you gradually add more stuff into the deck of rooms as well. So when you get good at the game and you're not dying, you build this big Metroidvania map every time you play, and what that means is you get the variation that you'd get in a proc gen game, but the player is part of the process, right? And I think that is an interesting thing about drafting games, and we're going to see some blueprints games that copy blueprints in not interesting ways, and then we're going to see some that copy it in really interesting ways. And I think the thing that's interesting about that board gamey type, you used to get it in Hero Quest, Advanced Hero Quest, where you would build the dungeon as you went along. It's the same sort of idea. Is that you're doing procedural generation and you're getting the benefits of procedural generation in terms of, this game gets to be different every time and you don't get bored and you can't like learn it and speed run it in a particular way. But you're involving the player in that process in a way that gives them another thing to think about. And there's lots you can do with that, right? Of like, the player now has this palette of stuff, but it's given to them in a random order. And they need to like understand, they need to gradually, as they play this game more and more, build like a mental model of how all of these pieces can be put together to achieve different goals, right? Mm-hmm. So it's not really proc gen in the way that most people would understand it, and it's kind of technically simpler than proc gen because it's just the player is stamping bits of the level down as they go around, and you can stamp them over each other, and they sort of delete bits of the previous room, which is quite interesting as well. You can like build a gold mine and then build something else over it, and it will smash all of the blocks with the gold in and stuff like that. So yeah, I'm interested in that concept, and I'm interested to see what other people do with it post blueprints as well. Because, like, basically, I guess what I'm saying is doing procedural generation at runtime, right, and then the player gets a different level is not the only possible way of doing a level that's different every time, I
think with that we can start to wrap things up. So I guess one question for you for your channel with the Indie Game Clinic. Any by the time this recording is on, it'll probably not be for at least a few weeks. Any like big events or anything that you're looking at doing for 2026 for the channel?
So last year we did a game jam called Collab Jam, and I'll probably run another jam with the same rules this year. It was basically it was a very simple game jam. The actual rules on what you could make were very simple, but the main rule was you couldn't make a game on your own. And I guess some of this is coming from an educational background that, like, when I set that up as our first Indie Game Clinic game jam, I wanted to make sure that the game jams that we run have like a specific kind of like pedagogical goal in mind. And when you're an educator, you sort of look at the community that you're working with and you go, what is the thing that they really struggle with? And you try and pick something there. So yeah, I just wanted to make sure we had something where it wasn't just encouraged to work with other people. It was just that was the only way you could enter, right? Because that's better encouragement than anything. And we had some really cool projects come out of that, and some people are still working on theirs. So yeah, a couple of months' time, we might do another one of those. And yeah, there'll be some new types of content coming out on the channel this year that I haven't done before, like some very I want to do some deeper dives on like specific games and go through their kind of production histories and stuff like that. So the kind of stuff that NoClip have been doing recently with their really long deep dives on a specific game, but like maybe with smaller games that get left out of that kind of thing. So yeah, just looking forward to doing all those sorts of things. I guess with this type of channel, you're always just trying to balance what people will click on with the thing that you're interested enough to spend the amount of time on. And a lot of the time it's like, I want to do things that like help other people or give them like an exercise to do. And then I've also got my own projects where it's just like, I'm really interested in that game and I want to spend loads of time researching it,
So any final thoughts or any final points or any of the topics that we talked about that you would like to add to take us out on?
No, I think we've covered so much, but I wanted to say thank you for having me. And I also, just in case we get anyone watching this who hasn't encountered you before, Josh, is that you have basically a book on pretty much every game genre, right?
Not yet, but now. Slowly but surely.
Almost. Yeah. So like I think all the discussion we had earlier about how people should kind of really understand the design space they're working in, Anyone who's kind of new to this channel and you've been working on a particular, or you're starting on a big project in a particular design space, I think it's probably well worth checking out one of these books because, and like you said, I think this is probably your rationale for doing those genre books, like, right? But what you said earlier of like, it's almost like game design is a different discipline for every genre, you know, of like, obviously there's top level psychological human stuff that filters into all of it. But yeah, learning to make this type of game is different from learning to make this type of game. So I can kind of see the benefit of having those deep dives on specific game types.
Yep.
So
Thank you.
Plugging you at the end of your own podcast, which I know is not how it usually works, but
thank you. I guess for people who are interested in more from you, obviously I'll include a link to your channel down below. Anything else you'd like to mention in terms of sites or socials?
It's just Indie Game Clinic on everything. I'm only really on YouTube and Blue Sky. I do stream on Twitch as well, just because there's some people that prefer to watch on there, but there's only about 10 of them at the moment. You can find me on any of those things. Not LinkedIn. I don't like LinkedIn. I'm only on there because we have to be. But,
yeah, I know that feeling. All right, and yeah, if you're free in the future, this has been a great conversation. We'll like to come back on. We can talk any more game design and academia chats. Let me know.
Yeah, and like when I finish DirtWorld and it's completely, been a total waste of time, we can do a post-mortem on that as well.
All right. Well,
it'll be called something like "Never Do a Genre Mashup" or something like
that. Great. Well, if you let me tickle your game and probably find all the bugs and accidentally crash it on stream, let me know, because I've gotten quite good at that when I play games from developers.
Amazing. Yeah, I'll take you up on that soon. Thank you.
No problem. Well, Joe, again, it has been a pleasure hanging out with you. Best of luck with the game. And like I said, if you're happy to do this again, I'll be happy to have you back on.
Thank you so much.
Cool. So, for everyone watching, we're going to end this conversation here. Be sure to check out Joe's channel. You'll find links to that down below. For me, do the YouTubing stuff, buy all the copies of my book that Joe just plugged before we ended the conversation. And as I said, if you are interested in coming on and check out your game, there are signups. And if you're interested in, as a first-time developer, me taking your game for my Debut Devs podcast series, or just showcase series, be sure to get in touch for that. So, come back for daily discussions on game design here and on game wisdom, where you see the art and science of games. And until our next conversation and podcast, have a great rest of your night.